The most dangerous intelligence operation of the decade wasn't exposed by a spy agency, a satellite, or a double agent. It was exposed by a $20 camera a neighbor bought to stop package thieves. That's not a hypothetical. That happened. Somewhere in a nondescript apartment in Petah Tikva, a city just east of Tel Aviv, a 26-year-old man named Daniel Kitov woke up one morning in early 2025 and checked his phone. There was a message waiting for him. It was from a contact he had been talking to for months, a man he knew only by a first name, someone who communicated exclusively through Telegram, who paid reliably and asked, as far as Kitov could tell, for almost nothing. The message had an address. Kitov was not a trained operative. He had no intelligence background, no military specialty, no ideological grievance that had driven him toward betrayal. He was a young man with a phone, a need for money, and a contact who had never once, in all the months they had been communicating, asked him to do anything that felt truly dangerous. That was the point. To understand how Kitov ended up walking toward the home of one of the most protected men in Israel, you have to understand the system that put him there. Iranian intelligence, specifically the IRGC's unit, 840, the foreign operations arm responsible for targeted assassinations and intelligence collection outside Iran's borders, had spent years refining a recruitment model that Western counterintelligence analysts now describe with a particular phrase. They call it graduated commitment. It works like this. You do not approach someone and ask them to spy. You approach them and ask them to do something that doesn't sound like spying at all. Photograph a street sign. Note the name of a building. Write a specific phrase on a wall in a neighborhood they already pass through on their way to work. The task is mundane. The payment is immediate. The communication is clean, encrypted, disposable. And then you wait. If they do it once, they will almost always do it again. Because the second task is only slightly different from the first, and the third task is only slightly different from the second. And by the time the fourth task arrives, by the time the request becomes specific enough to matter, the recruit is already carrying evidence of the first three tasks on their phone, in their transaction history, in their own memory. They are already compromised. The handlers in Tehran did not need loyalty, they needed leverage. And the architecture of the recruitment model built leverage automatically, task by task, payment by payment, long before the recruit ever understood what they were building toward. Kitov had received his first task sometime in late 2024. The specifics of those early missions, what exactly he was asked to photograph, where exactly he was sent, remain under Israeli court seal. But the pattern, documented across dozens of similar cases prosecuted in Israeli courts throughout 2024 and 2025, is consistent enough to reconstruct. Street-level photography, residential neighborhoods, specific vehicles or building facades, nothing that would register as threatening to a passerby, nothing that would trigger a security response, nothing that would feel, to the person doing it, like the beginning of something irreversible. He was paid in cryptocurrency. Fast, clean transfers. No bank involved. No paper trail that a casual observer would notice. He did it again. What Kitov did not know, what nobody at his level of the operation ever knew, was that his handler was not running him alone. Across Israel, in at least 4 other cities, other young men were receiving similar messages from contacts with similar names, similar communication styles, similar payment schedules. They did not know about each other. They were not meant to. In the coastal city of Rishon LeZion, a 40-year-old man named Vadim Kuprianov had been tasked with driving past a specific residential address in Ra'anana, a quiet suburb north of Tel Aviv, with a dashboard camera mounted in his car. His target was the home of former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. In another part of the country, two men, Roy Mizrahi and Almog Atias, both 25, had been given a different kind of task. They were told to purchase a CCTV camera with a built-in SIM card, a commercial product, available in any electronics shop. The kind of camera a small business owner might use to watch their storefront overnight. They were told where to install it. They were told whose house it would be watching. None of these operations were improvised. They were components of something larger, a systematic effort to build what intelligence analysts later described as targeting packages, the specific, granular, real-world intelligence required to plan and authorize a physical operation against a named individual. Not surveillance for its own sake, surveillance as preparation. But here is the question that nobody inside the operation had fully answered. What were they preparing for? A kidnapping? An assassination? A high-value intelligence extraction that would give Tehran leverage in negotiations it hadn't yet started? The answer to that question, the actual end goal of all this meticulous, distributed, low-profile reconnaissance, was not shared with the men carrying it out. Kitov didn't know. Kuprianov didn't know. Mizrahi and Atias didn't know. They knew their task. They knew their payment. They knew their contact's first name. That was all they were supposed to need. By the time Kitov received the message with the address in early 2025, he had already proven himself reliable. He had done the small tasks. He had not refused. He had not asked questions that his handler didn't want to answer. He had demonstrated, task by task, that he was what the operation needed him to be. And so, the tasking escalated. The address in the message was not a building facade or a street sign. It was the private, residential address of Ronan Bar, the director of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, the man responsible for domestic counterintelligence, the man whose organization had been shaken to its core by the intelligence failures of October 7th, and was, in early 2025, still in the process of rebuilding its credibility and its networks. The man, in other words, that Iran had every reason to want to find. Kitov drove to the neighborhood. He parked 2 streets away, as he had likely been instructed. He checked his phone. He began walking. The street was quiet. The houses were ordinary. There were no uniformed officers visible, no checkpoint, no obvious indicator that he was entering a zone under active security protection. To anyone watching, and to Kitov, it looked like a normal residential street on a normal afternoon. What he did not know, and what his handlers in Tehran had not accounted for, was that normal-looking residential streets in Israel in 2025 were not the same as normal-looking residential streets had been 5 or 10 years earlier. They were layered with something that hadn't existed in the last version of the IRGC's operational threat model. The neighbor's camera was small, off-white casing, mounted near the front door. The kind of device sold in electronics stores across the country, installed in an afternoon, connected to a home Wi-Fi network, and forgotten about until it sent an alert to a phone. It had not been placed there by Shin Bet. It had not been placed there as part of any surveillance operation. It had been placed there by someone who wanted to know if anyone was stealing their packages. It was recording. Kitov walked past it. He did not look at it. He had no reason to. And somewhere in the cloud infrastructure of a consumer electronics company, a file was created. A timestamp, a face, a direction of travel, a neighborhood. Unremarkable data. Until it wasn't. The question that should have been asked before Kitov ever parked that car, the question that, in retrospect, defines everything that followed, was not whether the mission was possible. It was whether anyone in Tehran had asked what had changed since the last time they had sent someone to walk down a street like this one. Had they? The photographs arrived in Tehran within hours. Street-level images, residential context, entry and exit angles, the kind of granular, ground truth intelligence that no satellite pass and no signals intercept can fully replicate, because satellites show rooftops and intercepts show intentions. But a man walking a street with a phone shows exactly what a target's world looks like from the perspective of someone who intends to enter it. From a purely operational standpoint, the mission had worked. Kitov had walked the street. He had captured what he was sent to capture. He had transmitted it cleanly and returned to his car without incident. The handler received confirmation. The file was logged. And somewhere in the layered bureaucracy of IRGC Unit 840's Foreign Operations Division, a targeting package grew slightly thicker. That is the moment worth pausing on. Not the arrest, not the camera, not the moment everything collapsed. This moment, the moment the operation appeared to succeed, because that appearance of success is precisely what made the next decision inevitable. When an operation works, you run it again. That is not recklessness. That is operational logic. You have a proven recruit, a proven route, a proven communication channel. You have a target that requires ongoing surveillance, not a single snapshot. You need confirmation of security patterns, not just a single afternoon's observation. So you send him back, or you send someone else, or both. This is where the architecture of the operation begins to betray itself. Because the same logic that made graduated commitment so effective at building recruits, the incremental, low-friction escalation from small tasks to significant ones, contained within it a structural flaw that only became visible under pressure. The model was designed for expansion. It had no mechanism for contraction. There was no point in the recruitment pipeline at which a handler in Tehran could reduce a recruit's exposure without either burning the asset entirely or leaving them in place with knowledge they had already accumulated. Kitov now knew an address. He had walked a street. He had transmitted images. That knowledge existed in his memory, on his phone, in his transaction history, and in whatever notes his handler had compiled. It could not be deleted retroactively. It could not be managed by simply going quiet for a few weeks. The operation had created a liability the moment it created an asset, and yet the handlers continued. Across the parallel threads of the same campaign, Mizrahi and Atias were now in possession of a commercially purchased CCTV camera with a built-in SIM card, hardware that had been bought, presumably, with money that could be traced, from a store that had cameras of its own. They had been given an installation location. They had been given a schedule. They had been given, in effect, everything they needed to complete a mission that was categorically different from anything they had done before. Because there is a meaningful distinction, legally, operationally, and in terms of personal risk, between photographing a street and installing a live surveillance camera on a minister's residential block. One is reconnaissance. The other is infrastructure. One produces a static image that tells a handler what a place looks like. The other produces a continuous feed that tells a handler when the target is home, when the security rotation changes, when a window of access opens. The CCTV camera was not intelligence collection. It was operational preparation for something that had already been authorized. At some point before the installation attempt, something happened that the court records describe only partially. Mizrahi and Atias drove to the neighborhood of Defense Minister Yisrael Katz's residence in Kfar Ahim. They had the camera. They had the SIM card. They had their instructions. And then they saw a Shin Bet security vehicle parked outside the residence. They did not complete the mission. They turned around, they left. Now, read that sequence carefully, because what it describes is not a successful abort. It describes two men who had already driven to a minister's home with surveillance equipment in their possession. who had already demonstrated intent to a degree that any prosecutor could work with, and who left not because they had been detected, but because the presence of a single visible security vehicle had been enough to stop them. One vehicle. That was the threshold. Not a checkpoint. Not a challenge from a security officer. Not a sign that their operation had been compromised. Just the sight of a parked car belonging to a service that, by definition, parks outside sensitive residences every day. They had been operating, until that moment, as though the absence of visible security was a reliable indicator of actual security levels. It was not. And the fact that a single parked vehicle was enough to abort the mission tells you something important about the confidence, or lack of it, that had been building inside the operation by this point. This is the fracture that official accounts don't dwell on. At the level of the individual recruit, by early 2025, there were signs of hesitation that the handler's communication model had not been designed to process. The model was transactional. Task, payment, confirmation. Task, payment, confirmation. The loop was tight and functional and left almost no room for a recruit to express doubt without implicitly withdrawing from the operation entirely. But doubt was accumulating. Kuprianov, the 40-year-old driving past Bennett's home in Ryanana with a dashboard camera, was not a 25-year-old man motivated primarily by the novelty of the arrangement. He was older. He understood, at some level, what the progression of tasks implied. He had been doing this long enough to recognize that the targets were not random. He continued anyway, which is itself a data point, because continuing under those conditions, continuing when the pattern is visible to you, when the targets have become recognizable, when the payments have become a dependency rather than a bonus, is not the behavior of a confident operative. It is the behavior of someone who no longer knows how to stop. This is the cost that was being seeded long before any arrest. Not the legal exposure, not the counterintelligence attention. Those were risks that could, in theory, have been managed if the operation had been tightly controlled from the top. The cost was human. Each recruit had crossed enough lines to make their situation feel irreversible. Each one had accumulated enough task history to make withdrawal feel as dangerous as continuation. Each one was, by this point, trapped. Not by coercion, not by ideology, but by the simple arithmetic of what they had already done. The handlers in Tehran had engineered this condition deliberately. But engineering a trap that catches your own assets as effectively as it catches your targets is not strategic genius. It is a design flaw that only becomes apparent when you need the assets to make a rational decision under pressure. Here is what was true while all of this was happening, and what none of the men in any of these parallel cells knew. Shin Bet had not been watching Daniel Kitov specifically. They had been watching a pattern. For 18 months before Kitov walked down that street, analysts inside Shin Bet's counterintelligence division had been processing what appeared, case by case, to be unrelated incidents of low-level espionage. Graffiti, photography, deliveries. Young men, no prior record, small cryptocurrency transfers, telegram contacts that went dark the moment an arrest was made. Individually, none of these cases rose to the level of a coordinated campaign. Collectively, they were unmistakable. The cryptocurrency wallets shared infrastructure. The telegram communication patterns, the sentence structures, the response timing, the escalation sequences were consistent across handlers who were almost certainly operating from the same institutional playbook. The geographic targets were not random. They clustered around a specific category of address, the private residences of Israel's senior security and defense leadership. Shin Bet did not need to catch Kitov in the act to understand what the act was part of. They already knew. What the doorbell camera provided was not discovery, it was documentation, and this is where the operation's core assumption collapses entirely. Tehran had built this network on the premise that its individual components were invisible, that small tasks performed by unconnected individuals in separate cities would never aggregate into a recognizable pattern. That premise had been reasonable in 2015. It was not reasonable in 2025. Because the tools available to a counterintelligence service analyzing distributed human networks had changed fundamentally in the intervening decade. Blockchain analytics, metadata pattern recognition across encrypted platforms, consumer surveillance infrastructure that required no human operator and no advanced placement. The IRGC's operational doctrine had not been updated to reflect any of this. They were running a 2014 playbook in a 2025 environment, and the environment had been watching them do it. So here is the question that the operation, in its final weeks, could not answer. If Shin Bet already knew, if the pattern had been visible for 18 months, if the targeting campaign had been identified and mapped before Kitov ever parked his car, then why were the recruits still walking? Why had no one been arrested sooner? What was Shin Bet waiting for? And if the answer to that question is what counterintelligence services always wait for, the moment when the full network is visible, when the evidence is complete, when the arrests can be made simultaneously across multiple cells, then something else follows from that. Every photograph transmitted while Shin Bet was watching. Every piece of intelligence collected while the pattern was already known. Every image of a minister's driveway. Every observation of a general's street. Every second of footage captured before the arrests came, all of it left Israel. All of it is still in Tehran. The network was burned. The intelligence survived. And that distinction between destroying a network and recovering what that network already took is the one that nobody in the post-arrest press releases chose to address directly. What did they take before we stopped them? That question has never been fully answered. It may never be. The second time a recruit walked toward a senior Israeli official's residence, the operation felt routine. That feeling was the problem. Routine is not a neutral state in intelligence work. Routine is the condition in which people stop asking the questions they asked the first time. It is the state in which a handler stops treating each task as a new exposure and starts treating it as a continuation of something already proven safe. And by early 2025, the handlers running these parallel cells had accumulated enough successful completions to have developed exactly that feeling. The tasks had been executed. The payments had cleared. The recruits had not been arrested. The communication channels had not gone dark unexpectedly. The targets had not visibly changed their security posture in ways that suggested detection. Everything looked, from Tehran's vantage point, like an operation that was working. Mizrahi and Atias had the camera in the back seat. They had purchased it exactly as instructed. A commercial CCTV unit with a built-in SIM card, the kind of hardware available at any electronics retailer, the kind of purchase that generates a receipt and a store record and a timestamp on a payment terminal, none of which their handler had specifically told them to avoid. That omission was not accidental. The handlers running graduated commitment operations relied on the recruits' own self-interest to manage their operational security. The assumption was that a person engaged in espionage would naturally avoid leaving traces. That common sense would substitute for explicit tradecraft training. That assumption had held across the earlier tasks. It held now too, almost. Mizrahi paid cash. Atias drove. They stayed off major routes on the way to Kfar Ahim. They did not discuss the specifics of the task on their phones, at least not in any way that would appear in later charging documents as a direct communication about the mission itself. They were careful in the ways that untrained people are careful. They were not careful in the ways that trained people know to be careful. The drive to Kfar Ahim took less than an hour. They knew the address. They had the installation equipment. They had a rough sense of where the camera needed to be positioned to provide a useful line of sight to the residence's primary entrance. What they did not have was a contingency. There had been no discussion of what to do if the street was not as expected. No alternate installation point. No fallback task that would make the visit look purposeful if someone asked why they were parked in a residential neighborhood with equipment in their car. In professional intelligence operations, this is called a cover for action, a plausible, innocent explanation for your presence that holds up under casual scrutiny. It is one of the first things a trained operative learns to construct before approaching any target location. It had not been provided to Mizrahi and Atias. Their handler had not considered it necessary. They turned onto the street, and there, parked outside the residence, was a Shin Bet security vehicle. Not a checkpoint, not a roadblock, not an officer standing in the road with a hand raised, just a parked car. The kind of vehicle that security services use for residential protection details, unmarked enough to avoid drawing public attention, recognizable enough to people who know what to look for. Mizrahi and Atias knew what to look for. They kept driving. They did not stop. They did not slow down noticeably. They made a turn at the end of the block and did not come back. From a narrow tactical perspective, this was the correct decision. But here is what that decision actually meant. They had driven to a government minister's home with a commercial surveillance device in their possession. They had turned onto the street. They had observed the security posture. They had turned around and left. Every one of those actions had occurred within range of the same kind of consumer surveillance infrastructure that had already captured Kitov's approach to the Shin Bet director's neighborhood. Cameras on doorposts. Cameras above garage doors. Cameras mounted on garden walls by residents who had bought them online because their neighbor's car had been scratched the previous spring. The neighborhood had not looked like a surveillance environment. It was one. They reported back to their handler that the installation had not been completed. The handler's response, reconstructed from what later appeared in court documentation, was not alarm. It was rescheduling. Come back when the vehicle is not there. Try a different approach. The task remains active. And this is the false release moment that the operation's internal logic produced almost automatically. Because they had turned around. They had not been stopped. No officer had approached the car. No phone had rung with an unknown number. No indication had reached them, or their handler, that their presence on that street had been noted, recorded, or flagged. Silence, in this context, felt like clearance. It was not. The incorrect assumption running through every layer of this operation, from the handlers in Tehran down to the recruits in their cars, was that detection would feel like something, that it would announce itself, that there would be a sign, an unusual police presence, a change in the target's routine, a sudden silence from a communication channel, a development that would register as a warning. Intelligence work produces that expectation because historical cases of blown operations tend to include a visible moment of exposure, the border crossing that goes wrong, the dead drop that's already been emptied, the contact who doesn't show up. But Shin Bet's counterintelligence methodology in this period was not designed to produce visible moments of exposure. It was designed to produce none. The purpose of watching a network rather than immediately dismantling it is precisely to deny the network any feedback signal. You let the operation continue. You let the recruits complete their tasks. You let the handlers believe the silence means safety. You wait. And the operation, receiving no signal to the contrary, continues operating according to its own internal logic, which means it continues escalating. Kuprianov made his drive past Bennett's home in Ra'anana on what the indictment describes as multiple occasions. Each pass was slightly different. Different time of day, different approach route, the dashboard camera rolling, capturing footage that was later transmitted to his Iranian contact in exchange for cryptocurrency deposits that cleared within hours. He was not a young man acting on impulse. He was a 40-year-old who had been in this long enough to have developed a methodology. And on at least one of those drives, according to what can be inferred from the structure of the charges filed against him, something made him hesitate. The specific nature of that hesitation has not been made public, but the fact that he was on what appeared to be his final tasked mission when he was arrested, rather than having been arrested mid-operation, suggests that he had reached a point where the weight of the accumulated tasks was affecting his behavior in ways that were detectable. He was moving more slowly, taking longer between missions. The pattern of his activity, reviewed in aggregate, showed the signature of someone who was continuing, because stopping felt more dangerous than proceeding, not because he believed in what he was doing. This is what the graduated commitment model looks like from the inside, at its end stage. Not a spy, not a traitor in any ideological sense. A man who had done something small, and then something slightly less small, and then something he couldn't talk himself out of, and then something he couldn't remember how to stop. And then a second recruit was sent to the same address. Leka Chow Demsash, 30, received instructions from his handler that were nearly identical to the ones Kupriyanov had received. Purchase a dashboard camera. Purchase a prepaid SIM card. Drive past the Bennett residence in Ra'anana and capture footage. The instructions were so similar, the target identical, the method identical, the equipment list identical, that the only rational explanation for running two recruits against the same target in overlapping timeframes is that the handler running the operation had either lost confidence in Kupriyanov's reliability or had simply applied the operation's redundancy doctrine without consideration of what doubling the exposure on a single target would mean for overall operational security. Two men. One address. The same instructions. Each unknown to the other. Each now doubling the footprint of an operation that was already visible to people who had been watching it for 18 months. Neither of them knew that. Demsash received his task the same way Kitov had received his, through telegram, through a contact with a casual first name, with payment confirmed in advance and instructions that were specific enough to execute and vague enough to seem almost innocent. He bought the camera. He bought the SIM card. He drove toward Ra'anana. He did not know that the man whose identical instructions he was following had already been under observation. He did not know that the address he was driving toward had already been driven past, photographed, and logged by someone else in the same network. He did not know that the handler who had sent both of them to the same house had already, without knowing it, handed investigators something they almost never get in a distributed human intelligence network. Confirmation, not suspicion, not pattern inference, not probabilistic analysis of cryptocurrency metadata. Two separate recruits, two separate communication chains, two separate sets of instructions, one address. Confirmation. The question was no longer whether the operation existed. The question was how much of it was still running that they hadn't found yet. The arrests did not come all at once. That is the detail that matters most when you try to understand what the fallout actually looked like, because the popular image of a counterintelligence operation concluding is a simultaneous sweep. Doors coming down at the same moment, a network neutralized in a single coordinated action. That is not what happened here. The arrests came in sequence, spaced across weeks, each one public enough to be reported, each one described in official language as an isolated success, each one framed as evidence that Israeli security services were on top of the threat. And each public arrest was also a signal. To every handler still running an active recruit, to every communication channel still open, to every Telegram account that had not yet gone dark. The network did not wait for a coordinated sweep. It began dismantling itself the moment the first arrest appeared in Israeli media. Kitov's arrest was followed almost immediately by the disappearance of his handler. The Telegram account went silent. The cryptocurrency wallet associated with his payments stopped receiving deposits. The contact name, the communication style, the operational fingerprint that Shinbet analysts had spent months mapping, all of it vanished behind the same encrypted infrastructure that had made the recruitment model so difficult to trace in the first place. This is the asymmetry that defines what happened next. Israel could arrest its citizens. It could not arrest the people who had recruited them. The handlers were in Tehran, or in Beirut, or somewhere else entirely, operating behind jurisdictions that Israeli law enforcement could not reach, behind identities that may not have been their real ones, behind devices that had already been wiped or discarded. The recruits faced prosecution. The architects faced nothing. Kuprianov was arrested. Demsash was arrested. Mizrahi and Atias were arrested. Kitov was processed through the Israeli court system. His indictment entered into the public record with the kind of procedural efficiency that makes individual human tragedies look like administrative events. In the charging documents, they were described in the flat language of counterintelligence law. Contacts with a foreign agent, transfer of information, conduct endangering state security. What the documents did not describe, what legal language is structurally incapable of describing, was the mechanism that had produced them. None of these men had set out to endanger state security. They had set out to make rent. And the operation that had recruited them had been specifically engineered to exploit that gap between what a person intends and what their actions produce, with a precision that no individual recruit could have recognized from inside the process. The fallout from the arrests did not resolve the underlying problem. It reframed it. Because within weeks of the first public arrest, Israeli prosecutors and security officials were confronting a question that the arrests themselves could not answer. What had already left the country? Every image Kitov had transmitted. Every pass Kuprianov had made past Bennett's residence. Every observation Mizrahi and Atias had made of Katz's neighborhood before turning their car around. All of it had been received. All of it had been processed. All of it existed in targeting files that Israeli law enforcement had no mechanism to recover, no jurisdiction to demand, and no ability to assess in terms of how it would be used or when. The network had been burned. The intelligence the network produced had not. This is the cost that the post-arrest statements did not address. Official communications after counterintelligence successes follow a predictable structure. Threat identified. Arrests made. Network disrupted. Public safety maintained. The language of resolution, of closure, of a problem that has been handled. What the language of resolution cannot accommodate is the admission that disrupting a network and recovering what that network collected are two entirely different outcomes, and that Israeli security services, for all the genuine skill involved in identifying and rolling up these cells, had achieved only one of them. The photographs of Ronan Bar's street were in Tehran. The surveillance footage of Bennett's neighborhood was in Tehran. The observations of Katz's residence, the approach routes, the security rotation patterns, the line of sight analysis for a camera installation that never happened, all of it was in Tehran. And Ronan Bar, the Shin Bet director whose home had been the first hard target in the operation, resigned from his position in early 2025. Not because of this operation specifically. The pressures that led to his departure were broader, rooted in the institutional reckoning that followed October 7th's catastrophic intelligence failure. But he was gone, and the targeting package that Iranian intelligence had assembled for a man who was now no longer in the same role, no longer at the same address, no longer carrying the same security profile, that package was now partly obsolete. Partly because the methodology it had demonstrated, that Israeli senior officials could be surveilled through recruited civilians operating below the threshold of traditional counterintelligence detection remained entirely valid. The operation had failed. The proof of concept had not. By the end of 2025, Israeli authorities had opened 35 espionage cases involving Iranian recruited Israeli civilians. 35. In a single year. The highest number ever recorded. A caseload that represented not a spike in Iranian ambition, but the visible edge of a campaign that had been running for years beneath the detection threshold, and that had now, through the combination of Shin Bet's pattern recognition and the accidental documentation produced by a neighbor's doorbell camera, become visible enough to prosecute. But 35 prosecutions also meant 35 sets of compromised intelligence, 35 recruitment pipelines, each of which had produced surveillance output before the recruit was identified. 35 points of entry into Israeli civilian life through which the IRGC had moved information out of the country, while the detection apparatus was still assembling the pattern. The arrests were real. The damage they represented was also real. Both things were true simultaneously. In June 2025, 1 month after the wave of arrests had moved through the Israeli court system, the Israeli National Cyber Directorate issued an emergency public warning. Iran, it said, had been systematically hacking private home security cameras across Israel. The same consumer IoT devices that had helped document Iranian human operatives approaching sensitive residential addresses were now being accessed remotely by Iranian cyber units seeking real-time intelligence on missile impact sites. The deputy director of the Cyber Directorate stated publicly that Iranian actors were attempting to connect to cameras to gather intelligence on missile strikes and improve targeting accuracy. Read that sequence in full. Human agents had been sent to walk streets. They were partly exposed by consumer cameras. The consumer cameras were then targeted for remote compromise by the same intelligence service that had sent the human agents. The surveillance infrastructure that had helped catch the spies became the next target of the operation it had helped disrupt. There was no clean conclusion. There was adaptation. Theirs, not ours. The doctrine that the IRGC had been running, graduated commitment, distributed human cells, redundant targeting, low-friction recruitment through encrypted platforms, had not been abandoned because it failed. It had been refined because it was partially successful. The parts that had been exposed would be adjusted. The parts that had produced usable intelligence before exposure would be preserved. The threshold calculations that had led to running 2 recruits against the same target would be revised. The threat model that had failed to account for consumer surveillance infrastructure would be updated, and the next version of the operation would be harder to see. The men who were arrested will be prosecuted under Israeli law. The men who recruited them will not be. The intelligence that was collected before the arrests will remain in Iranian targeting files. The homes that were photographed will not be unphotographed. Daniel Kitov walked down a street in early 2025 carrying his phone, following instructions from a man he had never met, toward a house belonging to a man he had never heard of, for reasons he was never told. The camera mounted by his neighbor caught his face, his direction, his timestamp. He did not see it. His handlers in Tehran did not account for it, and the gap between what they assumed the environment was and what the environment actually had become, that gap is what this operation ultimately documents, not a dramatic intelligence failure. Not a single catastrophic decision, a slow, compounding misjudgment about how much the world had changed while the doctrine stayed the same. If there is a single question worth sitting with after reviewing all of this, it is not whether the arrests were justified, or whether the recruits were naive, or whether Shin Bet acted quickly enough. The question is simpler. The next version of this operation is already running somewhere. What assumptions are we making about it that we haven't updated since the last time everything looked like it was working?